Have you ever wondered what lies behind a murder that seems all too obvious? Because I learned, the hard way, that when everything seems simple, that's precisely where the danger lies. And if you think businessmen are killed for money, wait until you find out what really kills when power is involved. But before I tell you this story, the most intense I've ever experienced, subscribe here on the channel. This helps me continue to bring truths that many people would rather keep buried. This case started, like all the others, a body, a locked room, a smoking gun. But the more I dug, the less greed I found, and the more I stumbled upon silence. On packs, on names, no one dares mention. So, if you enjoy true stories that defy common sense, leave a like and comment below about what you would do in my shoes, because what you're about to hear might change your view of justice forever. Everything I was taught about right and wrong dissolved in this case. There's no happy ending when the truth involves people who can't be arrested, but there is courage, and it was with courage and a bit of stubbornness that I reached the last strand of this web. A web that perhaps is still moving as you watch this. Now, get ready, because what happened to Eduardo Farias wasn't an ordinary crime. It was a warning, and what I discovered could put your trust in check and my life once again at risk. I've seen many strange deaths throughout my career, but nothing prepared me for what I found that morning. As soon as I entered the Farias Corp building, Eduardo's office was locked from the inside, the lights were off, and the smell, a bittersweet, metallic smell. Something inside me knew this wouldn't be a simple case. When the door was kicked in, everything stopped, as if time respected the dead. Eduardo Farias, the billionaire businessman whom many adored and others envied, was slumped over the table, shot in the head. One detail gave me chills. The gun was still smoking. No sign of forced entry. No sign of a struggle. The scene looked like it was set up for a cheap detective movie, and I hate it when people try to make my work sound like a poorly written script. The first police officers considered suicide, and to be honest, it would have been easier to accept that version. But true investigations aren't done with shortcuts. Eduardo's look, yes, even dead, told me something. There was tension in his jaw, and the position of his body was different from the pattern of a self-inflicted gunshot. It was as if it had been staged, but who would have that coldness? You know what bothered me most? The security cameras hadn't shown anyone entering or leaving the floor in the last 8 hours. Nothing, not a delivery person, not a cleaning lady. And that, to me, wasn't silence. It was a sign of manipulation. I still didn't know who was behind it, but something inside me told me this crime wasn't committed impulsively. It was planned, and whoever did it left clues. The first thing I ask when I arrive at a scene like this is, bring me the gun. And there it was, on the table, pointing directly at Eduardo's empty swivel chair. A sleek, personalized pistol, the kind powerful men like to flaunt, but with one absurd detail: no fingerprints. None, not Eduardo's, nor anyone else's. Do you know what that means? That someone wore gloves, cleaned up afterward, or manipulated the scene with a level of surgical care. No common criminal would think of that. This wasn't desperation, it was mastery. And if the gun was his, as the records claimed, why wasn't there even a hint of sweat from the owner's palm? It was getting on my nerves. The more I looked, the more meticulously calculated it all seemed. I've worked with people who covered their tracks, but this was different. Here, the absence of a trace was the trace itself. It's as if the killer wanted us to know he'd thought of everything. He wouldn't leave ordinary traces, but he'd leave enough to tease me, as if to say, let's see how good you really are, Catherine. And that's exactly what drives me in these cases. When I feel challenged, my mind lights up. It wasn't about Eduardo anymore. It was about something bigger, deeper, and perhaps more dangerous than I'd imagined. And it was when I reviewed the footage of the room that I noticed a subtle anomaly, and then everything began to fall apart. Rummaging through the victim's belongings, I found a black folder at the bottom of the locked drawer. Inside were printed copies of emails, all with the same pattern: capital letters, carefully chosen words, and no signatures. One threat per month. As if a reminder, you won't make it to the end of the year, one of them read. This wasn't just spite, it was a promise. Eduardo never reported it. No police report, no request for protection. This left me with two hypotheses. Either he thought he could handle it alone, or he knew exactly who was behind it. And that last hypothesis haunts me to this day. Because if it was someone he knew, someone close to him, his fear was different, not of dying, but of exposing the secret. I've seen many rich people choose silence over public shame. They prefer the risk of death to the risk of tarnishing their reputation. But Eduardo kept those letters for a reason. Something in me told me he wanted someone to find them. And when I examined the envelope of one of the threats, I noticed a silly but revealing detail. The stamp was incredibly old, out of circulation for years. I sent it to the lab, of course, and that's where the first concrete clue emerged. Traces of a substance used in thermal printers from the 2000s, now obsolete. It was as if the writer was trying to sound dated or nostalgic, but the linguistic pattern was too modern. It dawned on me, someone was pretending to be someone they weren't, and I was going to find out who. The morning before his death, Eduardo called the president of the foreign holding company, with whom he had been negotiating for months. The merger would be revealed at a press conference the following morning, broadcast live. It was more than a deal, it was a strategic move that would change the national market. By all indications, he was about to become even more powerful, or even more hated. Deals of this magnitude don't just create allies, they create enemies, with fancy names, greedy lawyers, and shady interests. This merger threatened to sever ties with traditional banks, change long-standing suppliers, and eliminate intermediaries. People who had been quietly making millions now had reason to silence Eduardo. The timing of the crime was too perfect to be a coincidence. I spoke with the legal team and learned that the merger agreement wouldn't be signed until the following morning. Eduardo had deliberately delayed, they said, as if waiting for something before finalizing it. Perhaps doubts, fear, or blackmail. I asked if he'd shared this hesitation with anyone. And that's when an assistant revealed, almost in a whisper, that Eduardo had requested a private meeting with someone outside the company, but didn't say who. The mystery of this meeting disturbed me. Who was this person? What was discussed? And why did Eduardo seem to be preparing so hard for something and then die before he could speak? Every merger, no matter how lucrative, has cracks. Sometimes it's not the money that's at stake, but what it conceals. And when I discovered what else he had changed before his death, everything changed. Lawyers don't usually get emotional easily, but the expression on the notary's face handling Eduardo's will seemed disconcerted. The businessman, who previously gave his fortune mostly to his family and renowned institutions, suddenly changed everything. He left 82% of his assets to a newly created NGO, with virtual headquarters, no track record, and no public staff. The name of the person in charge: Livia Tavares. At that moment, that name sent a chill down my spine. Livia had been Eduardo's personal secretary for almost 6 years. Discreet, efficient, almost invisible, until 3 months ago, she disappeared. I requested the company's CCTV footage, check her arrival and departure, and what I saw was even stranger. She left with 2 suitcases at 11 p.m. and was never seen again. Eduardo registered the change of will days later. His signature was there, legitimate, verified. But that didn't answer the question that gnawed at me. Why give everything to someone who disappeared? Guilt? Love? Blackmail? When I visited the NGO's registered address, I found only an empty warehouse with a makeshift sign and a camera pointed at the street. And it was precisely this camera that would lead me to my next clue. While most people saw a shell organization, I saw a deliberate trail. Eduardo knew death was near. The change in his will, the empty address, the connection with Livia, none of it was random. It was almost as if he wanted to lead me, step by step, through a board he'd set up himself. And the next piece was in the most obvious, or rather the most overlooked place. It was no secret that the relationship between Eduardo and his son Lucas was on the rocks. The last time they spoke in public ended with a glass of champagne thrown in the father's face and a shouted threat, "You will pay for everything you did to me." It was a gala event. Journalists, cameras, distinguished guests. Everyone saw it, but everyone pretended not to. Lucas was unstable, aggressive, consumed by addictions and resentments. Many called him a rebel, others crazy. I saw a broken young man, but I also noticed something else. He had anger in his eyes and intelligence behind it. When I tracked him down, he was admitted to a luxury rehab facility. He said he was cleansing his body, but he avoided any mention of his father. I spoke with a nurse. She told me that, the day before Eduardo died, Lucas had broken a mirror with his bare hands. He claimed to be hearing voices, patterns of self-sabotage, perhaps, or signs of guilt. When I asked about visitors, she hesitated. There was a woman who appeared frequently but used a false name. She didn't have photos but described herself as blonde, short, elegant. And it was at that moment that Livia's name came up again. The description fit perfectly. What was she doing? Visiting Lucas? Was she a link between father and son, or between crime and truth? This connection made me uneasy, because if Eduardo changed his will because of Livia, and she also had access to Lucas, perhaps the root of it all lay in the past, where many prefer not to dig. One detail that almost went unnoticed caught my attention: the safe built into the bookcase. It was ajar, with no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, and completely empty. But the most curious thing, not a single item was out of place in the room. Not a single paper was disturbed. Not a single drawer was open. The killer wasn't looking for something. He knew exactly what he was doing. This kind of behavior doesn't come from a common criminal. It comes from someone with access, familiarity, and above all, a very specific objective. I searched the company's files, looking for clues about what was usually stored there. Eduardo was methodical. He kept confidential transaction documents, and according to his accountant, some personal guarantees. This made me uneasy. If nothing was taken, then why was the safe open? There was a note left inside, small, carefully folded, almost imperceptible. The handwriting was thin, feminine. It simply said, "You shouldn't have messed with them." I knew instantly that that paper was worth more than any jewelry or contract. It was a message. And messages like that are only left by those who want to be noticed. On the back of the note, there was something even stranger, a symbol drawn with circular lines and 3 points. It reminded me of something I'd seen before, but not in conventional crimes. It was a group signature, and groups don't act on impulse. Groups silence. Groups protect. And when I realized where I'd seen that symbol before, what I found took my breath away. Helena Forias has always been seen as the Iron Lady of the business elite, cold, elegant, and strategic. When her husband was found dead, she wept on camera with the precision of an award-winning actress. She said she was at the riding club that night, at a charity dinner, and the check-in records indeed confirmed her presence. Until 10. But Eduardo's body wasn't found until 11:50 p.m., with an estimated time of death between 10:30 p.m. and 11:15 p.m. In other words, there was a loophole, and no one could prove what she did in that time. When I asked her, she replied with rehearsed calm, "I drove back home, alone. No GPS tracker, no camera along the route, a vacuum. And vacuums like that usually hide something." I spoke with the club's security guard, a young, nervous man with a good memory. He said he'd seen Helena arguing with someone in the parking lot before leaving. He didn't know who it was, but he remembered a curious detail. The woman threw something in the trash shortly afterward. I went over. The trash had already been collected, but I managed to trace the contents. Among the papers and napkins was a handkerchief with traces of dried blood. I sent the material to the lab and waited for the results, feeling that chill on the back of my neck that only appears when something important is approaching. If the blood was hers, perhaps a cut. But if it were Eduardo's, well, that would reopen the case in a dangerous way. And just when I thought I had found the central piece of the puzzle, a more shocking discovery crossed my path in the most unlikely place in the house. Matthias Antunes was not an easy man to deal with, too intelligent to take orders, and too proud to remain silent. He had been Eduardo's partner for almost 2 decades, until a financial disagreement forced him off the company's board, officially due to management differences. Unofficially, for questioning suspicious transactions between foundations, international accounts, and mismatched donations. When I went looking for him, I found him living on a farm, surrounded by files, old spreadsheets, and barely opened bottles of wine. It was as if he lived in self-imposed exile, obsessed with proving something. Eduardo wasn't a saint, but he wasn't stupid either, he said. handing me a box full of documents. Among them were bank statements, contracts with dubious clauses, and the strangest, proof of deposits made in the name of non-existent NGOs. I analyzed everything. The documents seemed too real to be forged. And among the names, one caught my eye. The same NGO to which Eduardo had left his inheritance. Everything connected, but what Mateus revealed next was what really set off alarm bells. Eduardo, according to him, had begun to clear his own name. He was gathering evidence against his own partners, and this could have been his death warrant. I asked why Mateus never took this to the police. He looked at me with a mixture of anger and defeat. Because anyone who launders money at that level also launders the system. And I knew he wasn't exaggerating. If Eduardo was truly trying to dismantle something he himself helped build, perhaps he underestimated those willing to silence him. And anyone trying to dig themselves out of a hole that big usually digs their own grave. The report arrived at 8:27 a.m., stamped by the IML and with a sentence that changed everything. Presence of benzodiazepine in high concentration. Translation: Eduardo had been sedated before his death, and this disproved the suicide theory. No one drugs themselves up to their necks, only to kill themselves minutes later. The body reacts slower, the reasoning becomes dulled. It had the feel of an ambush. I spoke with the medical examiner, an old acquaintance from other cases. She explained that the substance found caused drowsiness, mental confusion, and loss of reflexes. In other words, Eduardo wouldn't have had the strength to even lift the gun, much less to position the body in that almost theatrical way. It was as if they'd staged a last-minute, rushed production, but with too much technique to be amateurish. I returned to the crime scene, trying to reconstruct the final minutes with this new information. The glass of water on the table, intact. The coffee, also. But one detail eluded me, a gelatinous capsule stuck to the carpet, almost invisible. I sent it for analysis, results of the same substance as in the report. It hadn't been left carelessly, it was a message, or a trap. That capsule led me in a new direction, the executive floor kitchen, and there, inside the trash can, was a plastic spoon with similar traces. Someone had prepared something there, minutes before killing Eduardo, and if the poison came before the shot, perhaps the perpetrator didn't even expect to need the bullet, but something went wrong, or someone jumped in at the last second. Electronic security is like a beating heart. We only remember it exists when it stops. And that night, it did. The 14th floor system went offline for exactly 32 minutes, from 10:01 p.m. to 10:33 p.m., precisely when Eduardo was murdered. Too much of a coincidence for my taste. According to the report, it was a localized electrical failure. But I've heard better excuses from politicians. I went to the surveillance room. Everything seemed normal, except for one detail. The door had had its lock replaced. I asked the building manager, and he assured me there had been no recent replacement order. This left me wondering. I pulled up the recordings from the previous few days, and noticed that 3 nights before the crime, an unknown technician had been there for over 2 hours. No badge, no record. I requested the internal footage from the surveillance room itself, which curiously was only available until that very night. After that, black screen, they cut the feed from inside to outside. But you know what no one noticed? A forgotten camera, at the end of the hallway, facing the emergency exit. That camera was analog, old, but functional. And it was there that I encountered the first real shadow of the killer. The image was blurry, but revealing. Someone wearing a cap and gloves and carrying a briefcase exited the stairs at 10:40 p.m. Their face was hidden, but the way they walked, familiar. I replayed all the images I had of employees, visitors, delivery people. And then, like a flash in the dawn, I recognized the way they walked, and maybe, just maybe, the face behind the briefcase. But I needed to be sure, and to do that, I would return to the place where it all began, Eduardo's company. I've dismantled many scams, masquerading as philanthropic institutions, but this one was a real struggle. The NGO that inherited almost all of Eduardo's fortune had a nice name, a basic website, and an active CNPJ, Brazilian taxpayer identification number. But all it took was a little digging for everything to fall apart. The address was non-existent, the phone was out of service, and no activity was recorded in the last 24 months. It was like chasing a ghost, and he was smiling at every turn. I asked a digital forensic analyst for help. Within 2 hours, he determined that the NGO's website had been registered 2 months before Eduardo's death, with a CPF number linked to an offshore company in the Virgin Islands. The owner, a completely generic name, Lucas Silva, but the IP address for the website's creation came from within Farias Corp. Someone had created the cover for the crime using the victim's own headquarters. In the midst of all this, I thought about Livia again. That woman was the blind spot in the story, missing, an heiress, connected to the NGO, and more than that, she was the one who knew Eduardo's passwords, routines, and secrets best. People like that don't disappear without leaving a mark. I started cross-referencing data between the computer's internal logins and noticed something strange. After Livia disappeared, someone continued using her login at night, outside of business hours. Hackers leave trails, but infiltrated employees leave silences. Silences that scream for anyone who knows how to listen. And it was by following this digital trail that I found a hidden folder on the company server, with scanned documents, receipts, and a video. But this video, well, it couldn't be watched by just anyone. I needed a safe place, and courage, because what I was about to see might be irreversible. When I played the video hidden in the hidden folder, it took me a few seconds to understand what I was seeing. It was an old recording, of low quality, but the audio was clear. Eduardo was discussing the reverse surveillance operation with two men. I recognized the term from a case buried in the past, the Arcos scandal involving corporate espionage and bribery of IRS agents, a case that had been mysteriously dismissed. At the time, this scandal brought down 4 directors, but never reached the press. Eduardo wasn't a defendant. He was an informant. He gave up names in exchange for partial immunity, and from then on, he carried discreet bodyguards and lived in secure offices until everything returned to normal, or at least that's what he wanted the world to believe. I thought he had turned a corner, but the corner was turned on him. Arcos folder, filled with my scribbles from a decade ago, names of those involved, addresses, movements, and there, among the names of the old corrupt elite, was the same symbol drawn on the note found in the safe. It gave me chills. That mark wasn't just a message, it was a signature of something that survived, grew, and now wanted revenge. It was at that point that everything made sense. Eduardo didn't die because of an inheritance, nor jealousy, nor vanity. He died because he tried to right the past. He tried to emerge clean from a dirty deal that guaranteed his rise. But the past, when well buried, takes root, and Arcos's roots were alive, pervasive, and dangerously close to me. And an unexpected call only confirmed this hunch. Eduardo's cell phone call history was clean, too clean, even, but a common mistake experienced criminals make is forgetting that automatic backups also record data, and there it was, a 12-minute call made at 9:47 p.m., shortly before his death. The number belonged to Mariana Argento, an investigative journalist specializing in corporate corruption who disappeared 2 weeks ago. Mariana was known for delving too deeply into stories no one wanted to tell. It wasn't the first time she'd disappeared because of an investigation, but this time, the silence was deafening. No digital trace, no bank transactions, no posts. Everything stopped exactly the day after Eduardo's death. This wasn't a disappearance, it was an assisted disappearance. I went to her old apartment, the door was locked from the inside, the mail was piled up, and the laptop was on. The screen showed a draft of an article called The Hidden Legacy of Eduardo Farias. The text wasn't complete, but the individual sentences were chilling. A closed circle, a cursed inheritance, a fresh start, or a sentence. Mariana knew, maybe even more than I did, and she paid dearly for it. In the computer's trash, I found short videos, interviews with former employees, notes on political movements linked to Farias Corp. The most alarming, a document with the names of 3 current members of parliament who had allegedly received hidden donations through the so-called Shell NGO, the same NGO from the will. What had seemed like a local investigation now began to smell like a national conspiracy. It was on a cloudy Monday that Chief Barros called me in for a chat. I already knew something was coming. He doesn't schedule meetings outside the police station for no reason. Catherine, you're emotionally involved. It's blinding you, he said, peering over his glasses as if I were a rookie, but his tone was different. It wasn't concern, it was pressure disguised as protocol. Barrows has always been political, slippery. When he wants you to drop a case, it's because someone from above asked him to. And when I say from above, I don't mean heaven. Internal pressure, calls from plush offices, names that shouldn't be spoken aloud. He tried to convince me with pretty words, but I realized he knew more than he was letting on. And that made him dangerous. I did what I do best when someone tries to stop me. I smiled and remained silent. I don't argue with people armed with positions. I just keep digging, and that's exactly what I did. I got back to my car, opened my notebook, and highlighted his name in red. Barrows. If he was involved, even indirectly, I needed to know how deep the dirt went, because dirt, when covered up, turns to. And if Barrows was trying to remove me from the scene, it was because I was too close to something. And this closeness bothers people accustomed to living hidden behind power. So, for the first time in the case, I decided to stop following obvious clues and start observing the fake smiles. They always tell more than the physical traces, and the next fake smile came from a painting hanging on the crime scene wall. I always found Eduardo's taste in art curious. Nothing too sophisticated, but he had a passion for works that told discreet stories. On the wall next to the bookshelf hung a painting I'd seen hundreds of times, but never really looked at. It was an expressionist painting, with dark tones and bold brushstrokes. But something was wrong. The signature in the bottom corner was fake. Perhaps someone less attentive wouldn't even notice. But I grew up with my father, restoring old paintings. I recognize a forged signature from miles away. The true artist of that work died in 2009, but the signature used a line that only emerged later. It was subtle, but the fraud was there. The painting was a copy, and copies only enter executive suites for two reasons: vanity or secrecy. I removed the painting from the wall and, behind it, found a hidden compartment. Nothing fancy, but well fitted. Inside, a black flash drive, taped shut, hidden as if it were part of the frame. It wasn't there by accident. It was placed there intentionally, and there was only one plausible reason. Eduardo was storing something he couldn't leave in the wrong hands. I returned to my apartment, disconnected from the internet, and turned on a clean laptop. I plugged in the flash drive with the same feeling as someone about to open a Pandora's box. The files were encrypted, but there was a shortcut in the main area, simply called Final Act. I clicked it. What I saw wasn't just a clue, it was a confession. And a sentence. And it wasn't just for Eduardo. The video began with Eduardo, alone in his office, looking older than his years. The camera was at a fixed angle, as if he'd deliberately left it all on film. "If you're watching this, it's because I failed to make it out alive," he began. And then he began listing names: politicians, businessmen, judges, journalists, big names, untouchables, people who were now on my radar. The flash drive contained more than confessions. It contained contracts, spreadsheets, and international transactions involving exorbitant sums. The same shell NGOs surfaced with each embezzlement. There were overbilling schemes for public works, contracts with secret clauses, and agreements signed in pen, but washed in blood. This wasn't just corruption. It was a cartel, a parallel empire. From what I understand, Eduardo was part of this for years, but after Livia found out and confronted him with evidence, he decided to leave. But leaving wasn't an option. So he began compiling dossiers, recording conversations, gathering documents, and hiding everything in unlikely places, like this flash drive. It was his attempt at redemption, a posthumous confession, perhaps, or a final salvo against an enemy greater than himself. At the end of the video, Eduardo looks directly into the camera and says, "If I fall, this system falls with me." And for a second, I had the feeling he was talking to me, as if he knew I, and only I, would but what he perhaps didn't count on, was that I would take this truth to its ultimate consequences. Even if it meant risking everything, because now, I could no longer back down. The anonymous tip arrived by email, with no sender, just a screenshot of Google Maps with coordinates and the phrase, "She's still breathing." I went in person, without calling for backup. Something told me that if it was a trap, it was mine and no one else's. The farm was remote, silent, surrounded by forest and dust. I knocked on the door and waited. It was she who opened it. Livia. Thinner, with dark circles under her eyes and trembling hands. She hesitated before speaking. After a few minutes of silence, she simply whispered, "You're Catherine, right?" I nodded. And that was the beginning of the most intense outburst of my career. Livia wasn't hiding. She had been hit. After confronting Eduardo with evidence of the cartel, he helped her escape, not out of guilt, but out of strategy. He knew she would be the next target, and he didn't want any more blood on his back. She said she spent months in a panic, moving from place to place, sleeping with a knife under her pillow. Eduardo kept her informed, until last week, when the messages stopped. When he died, I knew it was my turn. Livia knew everything: names, routes, accounts, blackmail, everything stored in her memory and in a handwritten notebook. A notebook she handed to me, with tears in her eyes. I asked her to come with me. I needed to protect her, and I needed her to be heard. But she refused. "Catherine, if I show up, the world will erase me in 48 hours. I agreed. Sometimes, survival is the greatest act of courage. I left with a notebook, a promise, and the weight of a secret that could implode the country. But there was still one missing piece. A piece that led me straight to my path. I received the return dead envelope on my desk, inside the police station. That would have been strange enough, but what was inside was worse. A photo of my sister dead 15 years ago, in the same alley where she'd been found. But now, with the image enlarged, I saw something I'd never noticed before. The same symbol, left on the note in Eduardo's safe. It knocked me off my feet. The case was more personal than I'd imagined. I spent years trying to forget that night. My sister, a teenager, the victim of a botched robbery, but something about that investigation always felt wrong. Pieces were missing, witnesses were missing, and the reports were inconsistent. Now, it all came flooding back, and with a new certainty, the same group that executed Eduardo, or ordered his execution, also killed my sister, and perhaps many others. Threats started coming from all sides. Encrypted messages, fake profiles, silent calls. And I knew it wasn't paranoia. I was dealing with big people, people accustomed to giving orders and making anyone who got in their way disappear. They offered me money, then silence, and finally, fear. But it was too late to turn back. Those who threaten me don't understand one thing. I don't fight for justice. I fight for truth. And the truth, when it hurts, is what keeps me alive. It wasn't just about Eduardo, nor Mariana, nor Livia. It was about everyone who was swallowed up by this invisible system which devours reputations and lives without leaving a mark. And now, with a clear mind, I understood that the final step wouldn't be within the law, it would be outside. I wasn't just going to arrest the guilty, I was going to expose monsters. In the end, there were no headlines, there was no cry of victory, only silence. Some names were arrested, others disappeared before their arrest. The politicians mentioned denied everything. Companies were sold overnight. The public learned of an ongoing investigation. But I knew, and Livia knew, and whoever ordered Eduardo's murder also knew I wouldn't stop. I sent a copy of Livia's flash drive and notebook to 3 independent journalists. No mainstream media outlet agreed to publish. Too much fear, too much influence. But the truth has a funny way of escaping, like water through a crack. Little by little, alternative blogs began leaking parts of the story, and even without explicit names, people connected the dots. Whoever was to blame was on alert. Barros was transferred, Mariana never appeared again, Mateos disappeared from the map. And me, I followed, not as a heroine, but as a witness. I learned that justice and truth don't go hand in hand. Sometimes, all we achieve is preventing another crime, just making the next step a little more difficult for the enemy. And even then, it's worth it, because every truth revealed saves someone who doesn't even know what's at stake. On my desk, I keep the fake frame that hid the flash drive. From time to time, I look at it and remember, power likes to hide behind beautiful frames. But I'm still here, and as long as I'm here, no frame will hide what needs to be revealed. Because when justice fails, the truth needs someone to tell it, and that will always be my mission. If you've made it this far, You've probably already realized not every crime has a culprit, but every truth has a price. The question is, are you willing to pay for it? Because exposing what I saw cost me peace, friends, and perhaps even safety. But it brought me something no one can take away: clarity. And with clarity, we can't go back. Now I ask you, how many lies have you accepted simply because they seemed easier than the truth? How many times have you remained silent in the face of something you knew was wrong? This video isn't just about the murder of a businessman. It's about a system, one that continues to function. Because most people turn a blind eye, but you don't have to be one of them. Share this video with anyone you know who needs to hear this story. Leave a comment with what impacted you most. I read everything, and if you want to continue following investigations that don't make it to TV, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because as long as there's silence, I'll keep talking. And maybe, one day the next story won't be about me or you, but it will be told by us.